From secretly funding Harvard researchers to rewrite the nutritional narrative, to children developing fatty liver disease once only seen in alcoholics, modern nutrition has proven to be one of the most manipulated systems in history. And the worst part, the very foods we were told would kill us may have been protecting us all along. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden manipulation, reveal when the narrative was rewritten, break down what these flawed recommendations actually do inside your body, and prove why the very foods we've been conditioned to fear the most may actually be what our biology truly wants. So you're Ancel Keys in the 1950s. Middle-aged men, seemingly healthy, were dropping dead, and Americans need a solution. So you have a hypothesis that you think will save millions from dropping dead of heart disease. After all, you're a physiologist and a biochemist. You know exactly how the body works, and you've seen how arterial plaque is made from cholesterol and is involved in heart disease. You also know that saturated fat is related to cholesterol. So you create the famous diet heart hypothesis that you think links saturated fat to heart disease. But there's just one problem. You need more evidence. You need to show that what you're talking about actually holds true across the world. So you take your test subjects and you start feeding them tons of cholesterol. But for some reason, no matter how much cholesterol you feed them, their levels in their blood just won't go up. But here's what most people don't talk about. While Ancel Keys was trying to manipulate his hypothesis, there were others watching this unfold with billions of dollars at stakes at hand. By the early 1960s, sugar had become a billion-dollar industry, and early researchers like British physiologist John Yudkin were beginning to warn that sugar might be linked to heart disease. Of course, this was very inconvenient for an industry that completely relied on sugar for its profits. So the Sugar Research Foundation started paying very close attention to Keys' work. If Keys could convince the world that saturated fat was the problem, then sugar would automatically look innocent. And later, they would go even further. They would pay Harvard scientists to downplay every study linking sugar to disease, and elevate every paper that made fat look dangerous. This effort would be revealed decades later as Project 226, an operation designed to reshape the scientific narrative before the science reshaped public opinion. But we'll dive into this more later in the video. At this moment in the story, all we need to know is this: Ancel Keys needed a villain, the sugar industry needed a scapegoat, and saturated fat was about to take all of the blame. So now you need a new way to show the public that saturated fat and cholesterol are bad.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world.
Our hypothesis has been proven, and with this newfound knowledge given to the public, you will now save millions of lives for people now opting for grain, sugar, and seed oil-based foods that are very low in saturated fat. But there was just one issue. There was data available for 22 countries, but you already got everyone on board, and your research funding relies on this hypothesis. So by 1961, the American Heart Association started to recommend that butter should be replaced with highly processed seed oils like margarine, and that animal fat should be avoided so that we can all lower our cholesterol levels. Then by 1970, the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, brought forward the food pyramid. You watch as the world embraces your low-fat, high-carb idea. The American Heart Association and the USDA are on board, reshaping the nation's diet, all based on your one extremely poorly designed study. You have now become the hero in the fight against heart disease. But as the 1970s rolled in, something's just not adding up. The nation, following your guidance, is cutting down on fats, yet health problems are escalating. Obesity rates are climbing, diabetes is spreading, and heart disease is still a leading cause of death. People are questioning the narrative, but you're too deep in. Your study has influenced millions. Retracting now would be admitting to an unforgivable mistake. Your influence is undeniable. Doctors, nutritionists, and even the government have bought into the low-fat ideology. The food industry is turning out low-fat products, and your hypothesis has become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Here's new Kellogg's low-fat granola bars. All that crunchy granola, but only half the fat of the leading crunchy granola bar.
Kellogg's low-fat granola bars?
Hooray! These are good.
But let's give Ancel the benefit of the doubt here. Let's say there is a clear correlation and we can go based on his extremely poorly designed 7-country study. Well, first off, correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because something is correlated, does that mean that was the thing that caused it? In Canada, where I live, there seems to be a lot of ambulances wherever there is a medical emergency. Does that mean the ambulances caused the medical emergencies? Well, of course not. So now we know that correlation doesn't mean causation, and these two things can be completely unrelated. But this isn't the only issue with an observational study of this kind. For starters, surveying people on what they eat can be extremely inaccurate. For most people who eat a wide variety of foods, it can be extremely difficult to guess how much of what food was eaten over weeks, months, or even years. This leads to my next point: confounding factors. Confounding factors are other factors that come into play that could affect the data. For example, if you ask someone how much meat they ate in the past week and then strictly base your results on the amount of meat and nothing else, you don't account for all of the different ways that meat could have been eaten. Was it in a double cheeseburger from McDonald's? Was it a hot dog from Costco? Or was it just a full ribeye on its own with maybe a bit of salt? But it's not just the food, there are also lifestyle factors. Are people who eat more meat also more likely to smoke? Are they more likely to not exercise, etc.? As you can see, the results get muddied very quickly. And this is why it's so crazy to think that we could base the entire food pyramid and heart-healthy recommendations based on this data. If anything, this data should have made it very clear that we didn't know exactly what caused these diseases and that we needed to do far more research before we came to any conclusions. And what makes this even crazier is after all these recommendations were put into place and diseases skyrocketed even further, we still fall back on these recommendations to this day.
15 public schools in Brooklyn, we will be instituting Meatless Mondays.
Now, I'm not saying there's some global conspiracy and they're trying to make everyone sick, but let's just think about the incentives here. Nowadays, many of the nutritional studies that follow many of these same flawed parameters as the 7-country study are funded by giant corporations like Nestle and Coca-Cola. They also have no obligation to publish certain studies if they go against their agenda. So how likely is it that these big corporations that make billions off selling processed foods that are grain and carb based, which are perfectly aligned with the bulk of the food pyramid, have our best interests in mind? After all, over 70% of Americans at this point are either overweight or obese. This is one of the main reasons why nutrition seems to be so complicated nowadays. So many people are pushing flawed studies that they draw conclusions from which should have never even been considered in the first place. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, how do we properly control these studies then? Well, we can't. To have a properly controlled study, you would have to lock 2 twins in a lab from birth and control every single aspect of their being to ensure that they are all the same. Obviously, we can't do this. We've been looking in the wrong place, and when you look in the wrong place, you're going to get the wrong answers. The questions that we should be asking are, what foods are we meant to consume? What is our physiology designed for? If we've eaten something for the majority of our evolution, it is most likely going to be perfectly in line with our physiology. Do you really think highly processed seed oils that have just recently sprung into existence are going to be metabolized better in our bodies than, say, something like fatty red meat, which we have eaten for millions of years? It's highly unlikely. But now you might say, okay, but our ancestors only lived till like 35. But this is mostly because most babies died at birth, drastically reducing the average lifespan. And we do have the longest life expectancy ever recorded now. This is because our medical system has had some amazing breakthroughs allowing us to dramatically reduce mortality of newborns. But although our life expectancy is longer than ever, we are also sicker than ever. We are alive, but we are unwell. And if we're sicker than ever, then something else had to be driving it. Because removing saturated fat didn't fix the problem, it just seemed to have made it worse. And what's the ingredient that rushed in to take its place? Sugar. And it's not just refined sugar by itself, but carbohydrates, which all break down into sugar in the body. And uncovering how this happened leads us to one of the most quietly influential operations in nutrition history, a buried project known as Project 226. By the mid-1960s, the sugar industry was facing a serious problem. Researchers like British physiologist John Yudkin were publishing evidence suggesting that sugar wasn't just a bunch of empty calories, it was actually driving weight gain, metabolic disease, and possibly even heart disease itself. This made the big sugar executives very nervous. So instead of proving sugar was safe, they chose a far easier strategy: distract the world by making saturated fat look dangerous. And this is where Project 226 came in. Behind closed doors, the Sugar Research Foundation paid a team of Harvard scientists to write a definitive review that shifted blame away from sugar and onto saturated fat. At the time, researchers didn't even need to disclose conflicts of interest, so the sugar funding remained completely hidden. The total payment, $6,500 in 1965. For the modern equivalent of $50,000, the sugar industry helped rewrite the scientific foundation of nutritional policy, a decision that would contribute to decades of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. So, was it really worth that much disease for that little money?
Sugar, or sweet tastes, I should say to be more specific, have an incredibly potent ability to activate dopamine release within the mesolimbic reward pathway.
Fructose is addictive, activates the nucleus accumbens, the reward center of the brain, in the same way that cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol do.
But indeed, this is true. High fructose corn syrup and sucrose are exactly the same. They're both equally bad. Okay? They're both dangerous. They're both poison.
And carbohydrates are certainly addictive. Fructose actually is chemically addictive. It gives a dopamine response to the addiction centers of your brain, just like cocaine, heroin, meth, gambling. And we can measure this, we can track this.
The 1970s were a massive turning point in nutrition because this is when all of the blame was shifted onto fat. This all traced back to Ancel Keys and his infamous 7 country study, which demonized fat but conveniently let sugar off the hook. So once fat became the villain, the food industry pounced on this, stripping fat out of products and replacing it with sugar, selling it as a health food. That's when the real epidemic began, and even cereals like Cheerios loaded with sugar were suddenly considered heart healthy, simply because they were low in cholesterol. Obesity, diabetes, fatty liver disease, they've all skyrocketed since then, not just because junk food was more convenient, but because even our home-cooked meals are now built on a completely different fuel source. As a result, the average American consumes roughly 80 grams of sugar per day, and that's not even counting the carbohydrates that all break down into sugar in the body. But here's the key point that most people miss. Glucose and fructose are not the same. Glucose is a universal fuel, every cell in your body can use it, and if you don't eat it, your body can make it. Fructose, on the other hand, is completely different. Your body has no essential need for it, which means it goes straight into the liver. And once it's there, fructose is metabolized almost identically to alcohol. Same byproducts, same fat accumulation, same progression to insulin resistance and fatty liver. And that's why we now see children being diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a condition that until the 1990s only really existed in alcoholics. The only difference is that alcohol makes you feel drunk, while sugar does the same damage quietly with no immediate warning sign. But what if sugar isn't just acting like alcohol in your body, but also stimulating your brain like cocaine? Is it really your fault that sugar feels impossible to quit, or is it just an evolutionary mismatch? Roughly 300,000 years of survival instincts colliding with a food system designed to exploit them. The truth is, sugar addiction is hardwired into our biology, and because of this, the food industry has figured out exactly how to weaponize it against us to make a profit. For almost all of human history, sugar was very rare. Therefore, if you stumbled across ripe fruit or honey, binging on it made sense. It was a quick, safe hit of energy that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. But back then, a sweet hit of fruit was about as sweet as a carrot. That's right, even these so-called natural foods today are nothing like what our ancestors ever saw. A wild apple 1,000 years ago was tiny and sour and maybe closer to a crab apple. But modern apples, bananas, and grapes, they've all been selectively bred for centuries to be bigger, juicier, and engineered for maximum sweetness. The fruit aisle in your supermarket is basically candy disguised as being natural. And that's exactly why the craving stuck in our gene pool. There was never a strong enough negative selection pressure to remove it. Then came refinement. Just like chewing cocoa leaves gives a mild buzz, but refining them turns them into cocaine, creating a powerful drug. A stalk of sugarcane shoots slowly with all of its fiber, delivers sweetness gradually. But strip out all the fiber and concentrate the juice, and suddenly you've got a substance that's 10 times sweeter than nature intended. And once the food industry realized this mismatch, they doubled down. They discovered the bliss point, the exact combination of sugar, fat, and salt that maximally lights up your dopamine system. That's why almost all packaged foods today now have added sugar. Not just soda and candy, but bread, yogurt, pizza sauce, salad dressings, all carefully engineered to keep you hooked. And to make matters worse, kids are now bombarded with over 30,000 junk food ads every year, priming them for addiction before they even hit adulthood. And it's not just a coincidence. Kids are actively targeted by these corporations, because addiction is strongest when it starts young, and brand loyalty is formed long before you understand what you're eating. That's why cartoon mascots, sugary whole grain cereals, and ultra-processed lunchbox snacks are everywhere, not for nutrition, but for more conditioning. It's the same playbook that began with Project 226. Shape beliefs early, and you can hook them for life. After all, dietary carbohydrates and sugar are not essential. Our bodies actually run far more efficiently in a low carb or no carb state by creating ketones and creating any of the small amount of glucose that we do need through gluconeogenesis. Now, of course, knowing sugar is not essential and actually cutting it out are two very different things. That's why I created my Stoium Reset protocol that makes cutting out sugar effortless by default, because willpower alone almost never works. But why is sugar truly so addicting? In one famous study, rats were given the options between two bottles, one laced with cocaine and the other laced with sugar. Not only did most end up preferring the sugar-laced water bottle, but even the already cocaine-addicted rats still preferred the sugar. They even went as far as walking across electrified mats in order to get more. So what does this mean for humans? You might think, sure, those are just rats. But in people, sugar lights up these same reward pathways. It builds tolerance, meaning you need more and more to get the same hit. Because of this, when you try to cut back, you don't just crave it, you can actually get withdrawal symptoms like headaches, irritability, and fatigue. And it gets even worse. Fructose found in fruit juice and high fructose corn syrup is even more addictive than straight glucose. And the damage doesn't stop at your brain. All of that fructose goes straight into your liver. That's why kids today are being diagnosed with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a condition that only used to exist in alcoholics. But here's the key nuance. There are certain fats that can actually help the liver recover. This research suggests that saturated fat can actually help the liver recover, while industrial seed oils do the opposite. They keep the inflammation going and, in some cases, make the damage worse. So sugar might be the spark that lights the fire, but pairing it with the wrong kind of fat, you're basically just dumping gas on top of it. The main difference, unlike cocaine or alcohol, is that it's not as easy to just opt out. Not only because sugar is hidden in almost everything that you eat, but because most people don't even realize it's a problem in the first place. And that's the main trap. Sugar doesn't just hijack your brain and wreck your liver, it breaks your entire metabolic system. See, your body was designed to run on two fuels, sugar or fat. But the combination of the two is where things really start to break down. The two main fuel sources for your mitochondria, the little engines inside of your cells, is fat and carbohydrates. The Randle cycle kicks in when your cells are flooded with too much fuel, especially when fat and carbs show up together. At that point, the cell's energy system gets jammed and it prioritizes one fuel while blocking the other. Glucose use often slows down and sugar starts backing up in the blood. And the sugar in the blood isn't just there harmlessly, it starts sticking to proteins in a process called glycation. Think of it as caramelizing your insides. Glycation gums up your system, making tissues stiff, fragile, and inflamed. So your body scrambles to fix it. Therefore, it spikes insulin to get the sugar out of your bloodstream and store it as fat. But when this happens over and over non-stop, this eventually leads to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Now, technically, this is why some people claim to thrive on an extremely high sugar diet, like the sugar diet. If you only eat sugar or carbs with very little fat, you're mostly running on one fuel, so you don't trigger the Randle cycle traffic jam. But while you may feel fine in the short term, the long-term effects are far more questionable. Diets like this often lack the essential nutrients your body actually needs, which makes sense when you realize humans evolved eating mostly meat for the majority of our history. So while the Randle cycle was meant to protect your cells from energy overload, in today's environment of constant sugar and fat combos, it actually backfires. Therefore, instead of keeping you safe, it traps you in a vicious cycle of blood sugar spikes, fat storage, and long-term metabolic damage. So if sugar really causes all of this damage, why was the blame shifted onto fat? What if the foods we were terrified of for 60 years were actually the ones keeping us healthy? Cholesterol and saturated fat clog your arteries and cause heart attacks. Most people wouldn't even question this statement. This is why the famous Las Vegas restaurant called the Heart Attack Grill prides itself on serving meals that are loaded with fatty meat that is also loaded with both saturated fat and cholesterol. If you look a little closer at one of these meals, you'll notice something interesting. If you just remove the buns and some of the sauces, this meal begins to look a lot like the carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet. High in both protein and fat, with very little to no carbohydrates. Now, although many people would argue that the highly processed buns and condiments aren't necessarily healthy, they'd assume that the real heart stopper here is all of that fatty red meat. One of the main reasons why the notion that cholesterol clogs your arteries is the fact that the cholesterol compound itself is what begins to build up and close the arteries in people with heart disease. So if this is the case, are all the carnivores and ketogenic dieters doomed to suffer from heart disease and clogged arteries? Interestingly enough, recipes in food high in fat and cholesterol isn't really a new thing. In fact, most cookbooks from the 1800s are loaded with recipes that are primarily made with tallow, lard, and butter. This is also during a time when heart disease was at an all-time low. During this time, seed or vegetable oils were pretty much unheard of, but as the production of these highly processed seed oils became cheaper than using butter, use of seed oils started to rapidly increase in 1910, while at the same time, butter and animal-based cooking products began to slowly decrease. Nowadays, vegetable oils are promoted even more as they are shown to lower cholesterol, which is the exact substance that is found in the plaques of arteries. But the real question is, why did this cholesterol build up there in the first place? And what exactly is the role of cholesterol in the human body? Cholesterol to the cells of your body are kind of like what bricks are to a house. They help create and maintain the shape and stability, ensuring they are resilient from external pressures. Just like the bricks can be adjusted or replaced to fix or change a building, cholesterol helps cells to change and adapt when things around them change, like temperature or pressure. This keeps cells working well no matter what's going on around them. Not only this, but cholesterol is the backbone of many important hormones like testosterone. And in a scenario where your doctor thinks your cholesterol is too high, he will most likely prescribe you a statin, which is a medication that lowers your cholesterol. This is great news for you, especially if you're a male and don't like having any drive, as this is also shown to lower your testosterone in return.
The question is, what is the evidence that high LDL will kill you? This systematic review answered that question. 19 prospective cohort studies with over 68,000 participants were reviewed, and the overwhelming finding was that individuals with the highest LDL levels lived the longest. In fact, 16 of the 19 studies found this relationship. The higher the LDL level, the lower the chance of death.
Another interesting correlation is what is referred to as the French paradox. Despite France having one of the highest fat intakes, they also have the lowest rates of obesity and heart disease. As you can see in this graph, many of the countries that consume less saturated fat have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, while the ones that consume more saturated fat have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. Although this is just a correlation, so it can't prove anything cause and effect, the results seem to go against the mainstream narrative. Have we ever considered that maybe this isn't a paradox at all, and maybe these high-fat foods are actually protective against heart disease? This study from 2001 documented the changes in 3,572 elderly people's serum cholesterol concentrations over 20 years and compared them with their rates of death. They found that the group with the lowest cholesterol also had the lowest rate of survival. And not so surprisingly, the author's interpretation, we are unable to explain our results. But now you might be thinking, cholesterol must have something to do with heart disease. And this may be the case since scientists claim that oxidized cholesterol is what actually initiates the process that produces the buildup of plaque in the arteries. So the real question here is, how does this cholesterol become oxidized? And this is the part that almost everyone misses. Cholesterol doesn't oxidize on its own. It happens when your metabolism is already under stress, usually from chronically elevated sugar and insulin. Sugar creates the perfect environment for inflammation, and once that system is weakened, unstable seed oils pour gasoline on the fire. You may have heard of these seed oils online as people claiming they are either the worst thing ever, or that they are a heart-healthy alternative to something like butter, for example. One of the main issues with these oils, aside from the fact that they are just highly processed industrial oils labeled as food, is that they are high in PUFAs, or polyunsaturated fatty acids. Because of their structure, they are very unstable. This means that when they are exposed to oxygen or very high heats, like when frying foods, they can form very toxic byproducts. Some of these byproducts are called free radicals and aldehydes, which are well known to be toxic. This research shows that a typical meal fried in vegetable oil can contain hundreds of times more toxic aldehydes than what the WHO's safe daily limit is. Not only this, but it can be particularly problematic when these seed oils are used to fry foods high in cholesterol like meat. When frying these foods in vegetable oils, they create cholesterol oxidation products, or COPs, which, as the name suggests, causes the cholesterol in these foods to oxidize, leading to further inflammation in the body. But when we compare this to cooking in animal fats, high in saturated fat and cholesterol, they contain significantly less of these toxic byproducts. This is because these animal fats are high in monounsaturated and saturated fats, which are much more stable when being cooked at high heats. So it's not so surprising that articles like this exist, which state, the investigators reported then that a switch to corn oil from butter and other saturated fats did lower cholesterol levels, but made no significant difference in terms of heart attacks, deaths due to heart attacks, or overall deaths. Another point made by many knowledgeable doctors on this subject is the role of triglycerides.
The story we've been fed about LDL as the major cause of heart disease is clearly nonsense. When LDL becomes oxidised, however, it can become a problem, and the triglyceride to HDL ratio is a reliable way of predicting this. Even if LDL is not oxidised, a very elevated LDL level may be symptomatic of another issue that ought not be overlooked.
The point here is that there are far better markers to look at than just cholesterol when it comes to heart disease. Now let's take a step back for a minute. Sure, these studies are great, but they don't necessarily prove anything cause and effect. But neither do any of the studies that claim saturated fat and cholesterol are bad. So let's look at this from another perspective. Every animal on this planet has a species-appropriate, species-specific diet. This means that specific animals need to eat a specific diet to be healthy. For example, a cow needs to eat grasses and very specific types of grasses, while a lion needs to eat meat in order to stay in good health. This is because as these animals evolved over time, there were specific physiological adaptations to allow certain animals to metabolize specific foods properly. Even though cows and pandas, for example, both eat primarily plants, if a cow ate what a panda is supposed to eat and a panda ate what a cow is supposed to eat, they would both get very sick. Cows, for example, have evolved the physiological mechanisms to be able to digest these specific nutrients and, most importantly, anti-nutrients that are contained within those grasses and would not be able to break down bamboo properly. So if you knew a cow ate grass for hundreds of thousands of years of its evolution, it would only make sense to continue feeding it grass to keep it healthy. So what have humans been eating for the majority of our time here on this planet? Do we know? The rise in plant foods, especially processed foods that contain vegetable oils, are extremely new in the context of the time that we have been here on this earth as Homo sapiens sapiens. In fact, we do know what we've been eating for the majority of this time. As revealed by the stable isotope data, humans have been eating meat for hundreds of thousands of years. Not only this, but it specifically shows that we've targeted large ruminant animals, which are some of the highest fat-containing animals in the animal kingdom. So does it really make sense that after hundreds of thousands of years of eating meat loaded with saturated fat and cholesterol, that all of a sudden our physiology is just turning against us? After all, one of the only populations that still exists that eats exclusively meat are the Inuits, specifically the ones secluded from civilizations. In these populations, not only is heart disease not common, but almost any other modern day diseases, including cancer, are pretty much non-existent. Now let's take a look at how our recent dietary patterns have changed more recently, mostly due to the recommendations we've been given. We've swapped foods like whole milk and butter for almond milk and vegetable oils, while drastically reducing our beef and egg consumption. In return, we eat foods high in high fructose corn syrup, processed foods, and lean meats like turkey and chicken. So what do many of these foods have in common? After all, they're all very low in cholesterol. So what could be the issue here?
And the unfortunate thing that I see as a heart surgeon is lots of people with low cholesterol levels end up on my operating table.
So what I'm hearing you say, the likely cause, well, not likely cause, the cause of the damage is things like smoking and sugar, and then the cholesterol is likely there as a band-aid or a scab, and because of association, not causation, it's been given the blame for what's causing the problems further down.
The main problem with these foods is that they contribute to conditions like obesity, diabetes, inflammation, stress, and hypertension, which can all contribute to the initiation of the artery plaque formation. So, as you can see, there's been an endless amount of deception and manipulation within this industry. Sugar and seed oils, being the most profitable products in modern food, needed a villain. And these industries don't care about your biology, your health, or your long-term well-being, only the bottom line. And what it really comes down to is what our bodies have run on for the majority of our time here on this planet. Sugar, even in its natural form like fruit, isn't anything like we would have ever found in the wild, if we even found it at all. Seed oils are literally a toxic byproduct that needs to be extensively processed just so that they don't instantly kill you or make you extremely sick. With marketing, data manipulation, and diseases that take decades to show up, it's no wonder it feels almost impossible to know what's actually good for you. But here's the good news. Your biology hasn't changed that much over the last hundreds of thousands of years. The same physiology that kept us alive and allowed us to thrive during this time is still working inside you. And the moment you stop working against it and start aligning your habits to what it is designed for, is the moment everything starts to feel like it just works. So if you feel like you need a full reset and need some guidance on what exactly you can do to start aligning your habits with what our biology is truly designed for, make sure to check out my Stellium Reset protocol, which you can find in the description below.